Chapter 1. Attachment and Change. The therapist's role is analogous to that of a mother who provides her child with a secure base from which to explore the world. John Bowlby. In the world according to Bowlby, our lives, from the cradle to the grave, revolve around intimate attachments. Although our stance toward such attachments is shaped most influentially by our first relationships, we are also malleable. If our early involvements have been problematic, then subsequent relationships can offer second chances, perhaps affording us the potential to love, feel, and reflect with the freedom that flows from secure attachment. Psychotherapy at its best provides just such a healing relationship. Precisely how, as psychotherapists, we can enable our patients to grow beyond the limits imposed by their history is a question that attachment theory does not directly address. Yet the ongoing research inspired by Bowlby's original insights has enormous clinical value, offering us a progressively clearer view of the development of the self in a specifically relational context. In attempting to harness the power of this research, I have identified 3 findings that appear to have the most profound and fertile implications for psychotherapy. First, that co-created relationships of attachment are the key context for development. Second, that pre-verbal experience makes up the core of the developing self. And third, that the stance of the self toward experience predicts attachment security better than the facts of personal history themselves. In drawing out the clinical implications of these 3 core conclusions, I reach into the attachment literature, of course, but I also reach beyond it, not only to intersubjective and relational theory, but also to affective neuroscience, which Alan Shore calls the neurobiology of attachment, as well as cognitive science, trauma studies, and explorations of consciousness. The present chapter plumbs the 3 core findings regarding the developmental centrality of attachment relationships, pre-verbal experience, and the reflective function. And it distills their clinical yield in a model of psychotherapy that involves the transformation of the self through relationship. My aim here is to convey the orientation to emotional healing, the clinical philosophy derived from reviewing research, theory, and personal experience that underlies all the various approaches I take in order to be of help to my patients. As I will explain, the proposed model of psychotherapy as transformation through relationship describes a trajectory that parallels the unfolding story of attachment theory itself. Bowlby began by recognizing that attachment is a biological imperative rooted in evolutionary necessity. The attachment relationship to the caregivers is critical to the infant's physical and emotional survival and development. Given the requirement to attach, the infant must adapt to the caregiver, defensively excluding whatever behavior threatens the attachment bond. Mary Ainsworth's research then clarified that it is the quality of the nonverbal communication in the attachment relationship that determines the infant's security or insecurity, and along with it, the infant's approach to his or her own feelings. Mary Main's investigations illuminated the ways in which these early biologically mandated nonverbal interactions register in the infant as mental representations and rules for processing information that influence, in turn, how freely the older child, adolescent, and adult is able to think, feel, remember, and act. Finally, Main and Peter Fonagy highlighted the crucial importance of the stance of the self in relation to its own experience. They showed that security of attachment, resilience, and the ability to raise secure children are all correlated with the individual's capacity to adopt a reflective stance toward experience. Thus, from Bowlby to Ainsworth, Main, and Fonagy, the evolving narrative of attachment theory has unfolded through a focus on intimate bonds, the nonverbal realm, and the relation of the self to experience. The same 3 themes organize the model of therapy as transformation through relationship. In this model, the patient's attachment relationship to the therapist is foundational and primary. It supplies the secure base that is the sine qua non for exploration, development, and change. This sense of a secure base arises from the attuned therapist's effectiveness in helping the patient to tolerate, modulate, and communicate difficult feelings. By virtue of the felt security generated through such affect-regulating interactions, the therapeutic relationship can provide a context for accessing disavowed or disassociated experiences within the patient that have not, and perhaps cannot, be put into words. The relationship is also a context within which the therapist and patient, having made room for these experiences, can attempt to make sense of them. Accessing, articulating, and reflecting upon dissociated and unverbalized feelings, thoughts, and impulses strengthen the patient's narrative competence and help to shift in a more reflective direction the patient's stance toward experience. Overall, the relational, emotional, reflective process at the heart of an attachment-focused therapy facilitates the integration of disowned experience, thus fostering in the patient a more coherent and secure sense of self. Transformative relationships. Very much as the original attachment relationships allowed the child to develop, it is ultimately the new relationship of attachment with the therapist that allows the patient to change. To paraphrase Bowlby, such a relationship provides a secure base that enables the patient to take the risk of feeling what he is not supposed to feel and knowing what he is not supposed to know. The therapist's role here is to help the patient both to deconstruct the attachment patterns of the past and to construct new ones in the present. As we have seen, the patterns played out in our first attachments are reflected subsequently not only in the ways we relate to others, but also in our habits of feeling and thinking. Correspondingly, the patient's relationship with the therapist has the potential to generate fresh patterns of affect regulation and thought, as well as attachment. Put differently, the therapeutic relationship is a developmental crucible within which the patient's relation to his own experience of internal and external reality can be fundamentally transformed. The unknown thought. Given the pre-linguistic roots of the patient's original attachment patterns and the disavowals and dissociations they may have demanded, the therapist must tune in to the nonverbal expressions of experience for which the patient has as yet no words. That is, the therapist must find ways to connect with what Christopher Bolas has called the patient's unthought known. Grasping the unspoken or unthinkable subtext of the therapeutic conversation requires what several writers have referred to as the clinician's binocular vision that tracks the subjectivity of both the patient and the therapist. The underlying assumption here is that the patient who cannot or will not articulate his own dissociated or disavowed experience will evoke it in others, enact it with others, or embody it. The clinical implication is that the therapist must pay particular attention to her own subjective experience, to the transference-countertransference enactments jointly created by patient and therapist, and to the nonverbal language of emotion and the body, for all these are routes to accessing and eventually integrating what the patient has had to deny or disown. The stance toward experience. Representation, reflection, and mindfulness. Along with its emphasis on the centrality of relational and nonverbal experience, attachment research underscores the salience of the reflective function and metacognition. More broadly, this research reveals the decisive impact of the stance of the self toward its own experience.